If everybody could please take their seats, we're going to conclude. We have one final panel, which will be a great way to sort of pull everything together that you've heard. If everyone could please take their seats, we'd appreciate it. I know it's been a long day, and soon we will be heading to our reception. I hope you can all come. I want to just get started by, again, acknowledging the leadership of Jessica Hellmann, who is taking the helm here on this panel as the moderator, and we're going to bring back a couple of our keynotes and a couple of new faces that haven't been up here yet, just to help us think through what we've heard today and what are the big takeaways. I want to thank Dr. Jessica Hellmann, who's, as I mentioned, our director at I&E, a wonderful leader, and also in her spare time an internationally recognized expert on global change, ecology, and climate adaptation, and a fantastic science communicator. So you are the right woman to communicate and keep everybody on track and paying attention for the next few minutes until we have to be out of this room at 4 o'clock. Thank you. Please.
All right, thank you, Ellen. This is turned on, yes? Okay. Well, good news is these guys have already been sitting up here debating the synthesis for the day. So half of our work is done. But you didn't hear it, so I guess maybe we can start over again. So we have two faces you might already recognize from presentations earlier today, Dr. Imre Gyuk and Dr. George Crabtree, and we have two new folks with us that I'll briefly introduce. I'm going to invite each of them to share their thoughts. I have a couple questions I've been dying to ask, which is the privilege of the moderator, and then you'll fill out those cards. This is a chance to ask the big questions, the things you've been wondering about all day long. These are the folks to answer them. So please fill those out and send them up here. We're going to spend at least half of this time doing Q&A from the audience. No? Live Q&A. You have to stand up and take credit for your question or comment. Okay, great. So I'd like to I'll introduce both of you. Oh. Yeah. Lissa Pawlisch from the Clean Energy Resource Teams, which is this amazing organization we have here at the University of Minnesota that connects communities with resources and expertise that they need to pursue their own clean energy projects. She's going to share some thoughts with us. The CERTs, as we call it, the Clean Energy Resource Teams, is part of the Regional Sustainable Development Partnerships here in the University of Minnesota Extension. And Beth Soholt is the executive director of Wind on the Wires, which is a nonprofit organization many of you may already know, dedicated to increasing the penetration of wind on the grid and bringing more wind to market. So Lissa, we'll start with you. If you give us a few minutes of your synthetic thoughts, things you'd like to add, highlights you see, and then we'll turn to Beth, and then we'll address some questions as a group.
Okay. Good afternoon. I'll do my best to be brief because we really want to get to your questions. And wine. And the wine. Apparently Jessica would also like to get to the wine, but perhaps all of you would as well. I work for a team, and it's actually a partnership that really focuses on communities. So it's perhaps not surprising that when I came in today, I came with sort of a set of questions I was hoping to have answered that really started to get into that notion of how does storage democratize our energy system? So how does it get more people involved? And I had a whole series of questions that I wanted to, really understand at the end of this, which included things like, so what kind of storage are we actually talking about? What kind of applications are we talking about? On which side of the meter? So a lot of that discussion about use cases and all of that. But also sort of at what scale? Who will own it? Who will pay for it? Who will finance it? And how does that play differently in all of those different scales? Because that will really matter in terms of getting to deployment. I was super excited to hear the whole notion of being very, very focused on consumers. And really, I think that could be interpreted as very, very focused on community. But as we think about all of those customers, I was overwhelmed today, and maybe some other people can sort of like nod along with me, when I thought about all of the things as a consumer or a customer we were now faced with understanding. and that was kind of intimidating. And it made me think about so much of how what we've experienced, even just with the rise of solar in our state in the last couple of years, of people really needing to understand a whole new different business model, a set of actors, a different set of rules, and how do we actually then, as consumers, be proactive in that environment? And there's a whole lot of stuff we're gonna have to learn in this one too, and I think that education and engagement piece is going to be huge in terms of making sure that we get this done right, and really thinking about models that could be plug and play, but also how do we design models that are adaptable for that target use case that we're trying to get to. And then there were just 3 little things that I was sort of struck by repeatedly today. First of all, apparently none of us should have said that cost was a barrier. I'll count myself in the group that did, and I was like, oh, wow. That's something that we're gonna have to stay on top of and be very cognizant of as we have these conversations, and that every time somebody says storage is just too expensive, it is on us to challenge that assumption. I thought it was huge, the focus on peak demand, and how this is a tool that is ready right now. And honestly, I care about deployment. Let's start looking at that deployment yet this afternoon over wine, okay? And finally, aggregation. Aggregation, aggregation, aggregation. And especially to get to all of those end-use consumers, let's think about how do we come together as consumers and make this happen, and what are those business models, not just the technology, but the business models that are gonna make that happen.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much to the folks that put together the conference for inviting me to share some thoughts. It's a very daunting task to try to aggregate everything and say something intelligent from all the things we've heard today, but I am going to give it my best shot. So it's interesting to hear Lissa talk about her perspective, because I think we have complementary perspectives. We were just discussing that before we got up on stage. So Wind on the Wires works with utilities. Our members include NGOs working on clean energy policies and deployment and implementation. We have industry members that contribute to our organization, and we're working on wind, solar, and storage, particularly at the MISO grid operator level. And the frame I'm going to talk about a little bit is what I see happening in the Midwest, and then kind of segmented into 3 different audiences, key audiences for this discussion, and a couple thoughts for each one of those. So as we've heard from the very beginning of today, we have the MISO energy market that we in the Midwest operate in. We are undergoing in the MISO market a big generation shift. So a lot more coal plants coming offline, utilities retrofitting from coal to natural gas in some cases, but a lot of renewables. So Claire talked about the wind piece, but solar coming really strongly right behind it. So there's a lot of debate at MISO around market rules, system operations, products and tools that we're going to need for this generation shift, and other services and products like ancillary services. And so this is a really good time to be asking these questions. In Minnesota, as a speaker also talked about, we have these big decisions before us from a number of utilities of what they need to invest in next as they kind of look out over a 15-year horizon. And utilities have a preference for certain types of things. They want things they can invest in for rate base. They are most comfortable operating the system with familiar types of resources. And they're particularly focused on natural gas right now. We think that may be a little bit short-sighted, and would like to challenge them to think about emerging technologies like storage. But it's in the context of what does the system need, and looking at what the system writ large needs and who can most cost effectively provide those services. So we would like to go technology neutral and ask which new emerging technology or which resource can provide grid services most cost effectively. And then I think then you get to the customer aspect, and you get to the asking questions about new technologies piece. And so when, so again, we're just in this really good space and time to have this conversation. So the three audiences that I've kind of called out are the renewable energy and storage developers who are in the room. You've got a job to do to really look at opportunities to intervene and offer your products and services. So that's one thing we need to do. You know, for state regulators, and I would include, you know, most of us in this category, we have a lot more education to do. You know, I think we just scratched the surface today and in the summit a couple years ago, but a lot of things have changed. So how can we make sure we keep up to date? Our planning models, or the models that utilities use to strategist or whatever to compare resource options, don't accommodate storage. So our models need to change and adapt to the new technologies. Then I think Commissioner Lang mentioned we need metrics. So looking at storage, it's as compared to what? And that level playing field look at what's the best technology and most economic to do is the question we have to ask. Then just finally, really quickly, at the MISO level, MISO has just launched their energy storage task force, and so there will be a lot of stakeholder involvement to talk about what kind of market rules need to be in place. And so I'm looking forward to seeing both behind-the-meter distributed and bulk transmission interconnected resources be able to compete in the marketplace.
Wonderful. Those are terrific observations. Thank you, both of you. So I'll ask a question then of Imre and George, and it builds directly off of this comment that you just made, Beth, that it strikes me that we talk about energy storage as if it is a thing. But it is differing technologies. We've talked a lot today about battery technology, but there are lots of other kinds of storage technologies. It's at different locations, behind the meter, for lots of different values, some of which are monetized and some of which are not. And even, it strikes me from today, there are different objectives. Some people, in Mary Powell's speech, she emphasized people's desire to get off the grid. In other remarks, we heard about the importance of the grid as a storage device itself of sorts. So how do we navigate? This is an easy question. So differing technologies, differing objectives, and differing scales. Where do you start? How would you explain to this point of education the interconnection of those? How do you enter that huge complexity? What would you make of that? Those contradictions.
Do you want to?
No, go ahead.
I'll give it a shot. Okay, great question. Yeah. You can clean up everything I say wrong, Imre. I'm sure. It's a great question. So what comes to mind right away, you may find this surprising when I say it, is my laptop computer. Because when computers first came out, we had big arguments, and this was 20 years ago. Should organizations buy laptops or not? What are they good for? Well, I might be able to send email on it. But nowadays, we don't even think about it. Of course you need a computer, because that's how everyone operates. And I think storage has a lot of the same capabilities and the same characteristics. It does so much in so many ways for so many functions that, of course, you want storage. And we haven't come around to thinking about storage like that. We think of it, as you said, as it's a thing. Well, how would I use that thing? Well, maybe I could arbitrage with it. Well, it turns out, yeah, you can, but it's not that good of it doesn't work that well. But maybe I could do this. Maybe it turns out it can do a lot of things. So my takeaway, as we were saying, what are the takeaways from this conference, is that we're a lot farther along than we were. I think the second highest bar, let's see if anyone argues with this, was lack of knowledge. We don't understand storage. Besides cost, that was the next big barrier. And I think we're coming a long way on doing that. So what we heard in the last panel that I was on, for example, these case studies where it turns out, well, with present costs and present technology, it makes sense for the next 10 years in Minnesota to use storage. And that was a revelation to me as I commented. I thought that's surprising to me. And then we heard from Tesla that we should be challenging that big bar. Maybe we should. And that's something that maybe we didn't know 5 years ago. So I kind of think of storage as coming out. Everyone finally saying, yeah, let's do some more here. I think there's a lot to do with education, and I'm very happy to see the specific use cases that we're looking at. Because as everyone has emphasized, they're different depending on where you are in the country and who you're doing the use case for and what is it you want to get out of it. But the more that we find that indeed it does work, that'll build the momentum. I would be curious for one thing, and it's probably too early to do this, but of all the use cases you could make in the United States, this is a big vision, how many would find, what percentage would find that storage is economically valuable right now? If it's 5% and we happen to hear those 5% today, it's different than if it's getting to be more like 20% or 30% or a bigger number. So I don't know, those some thoughts. It's really hard to get, yeah.
And the switch should go up. There you go.
Okay, well, you said that storage is coming out. You meant something else, but it's coming out in the sense of a baby coming out, being born. It needs not only one midwife, but a whole collection of midwives. And so maybe it's a good idea that we have finally reached parity at least on the stage here, with more women than men. This is very good. Yeah, it's taken a while, and that's still not the case in the audience. Next year. Okay, well, indeed, it's really important to realize that there is no such thing as storage any more than there is electricity. You don't say, okay, I think I'm going to put electricity in my house. Well, at least nowadays you don't. But, there's a whole gamut, and it's several dimensional of use cases, applications, and so on. We, in fact, have an office that takes care of batteries for transportation, and then we have batteries for stationary applications. And these are really quite different. You cannot just interchange those because the specifications for storage batteries, for stationary storage batteries, are quite different from car batteries. And you can't just take one and take it for the other use, because what you will find is you find that the efficiency goes down very fast. If you take a car battery and you use it for let's say for frequency regulation, you will find that it degenerates much faster than other things. It's also important to remember that you have to distinguish between power batteries and energy batteries, or if you wish, long duration and short duration batteries. Okay, most of our experience at the moment is with relatively short duration lithium ion. I have the feeling we are now moving towards longer duration batteries as we explore use cases like peakers that involve long durations, and that brings on flow batteries and a whole other families of batteries. Now, in terms of how important is cost, I have always, to some degree, considered cost a red herring. You have to remember that for each use case, you have a whole probability spectrum of conditions, and therefore, even if on the average this particular application is not ready for using batteries for. There are conditions, niches, if you wish, which are. Okay, and this has been so for quite a while now. For example, the case was mentioned of using batteries for deferring upgrades for substations. We did this 12 years ago. You know, we happened to have one where it was very cost effective and so on. But most of these business cases have been feasible for quite a while now, except as the cost of batteries and power electronics and the cost, the balance of plant goes down, the number of potential solutions via storage goes up. You know, I'm not aiming for 100%. There are some situations where it'll never work, but on the other hand, in some situations, it's a done thing. Thank you.
Georgia, I hadn't heard that observation about computing before. I think that's actually a spectacular analogy, because as I was asking that question, I was thinking about what is the right technology for the right applications, and imagining them as, in some ways, as non-overlapping. But if you think about computing, this thing really isn't very different than my laptop computer over there, and yet last night I filled out an Apple survey that asked me, which devices do I use? Do I have an iPad? Yes. Do I have a laptop computer? Yes. Do I have a desktop computer? Yes. Do I have a phone? Yes. And I have an Apple Watch. And all of those are similar devices playing a role in computing technology. So I think that's actually, to this point about education and talking about cost and searching for the optimal solution and being willing to take action now and put things into practice. Think about how we do that with computing.
It's like it's like trying to find the perfect wife or husband, as the case might be.
Yeah, we all know that's
It's not,
pointless.
It's not just
Yeah.
I'm not going anywhere near that one.
Okay, we gotta move on.
That's not the analogy that's going to help us.
Just not going to help us. One tiny comment on the computer, though. We think of the lithium-ion battery as the battery, and that's the dominant
Yes.
battery today. But you just mentioned a whole lot of computer-type, personal electronics that are different. They have a lot of similarities, but each one has a function. Your laptop you wouldn't use the way you use a smartphone. You just wouldn't. But yet they're very similar. And I think we need that kind of diversity, especially for the grid. Not so much for transportation, but that's a diversity that we need to look for.
Okay, great. I'm going to ask one question, then I'm ready for audience questions. Okay, this is I have two social questions I want to ask, and I'll ask both of them, and you can pick up whichever one you want, each of you. We can go down the line. One I feel like just must be asked, and that is, we haven't talked much about the sort of social justice or equity pieces of the broader storage conversation we've been having. But how do we make certain, we've talked about cost, which certainly has equitable dimensions to it, but how do we make certain that the benefits of deploying storage through our energy system are widely distributed? That is my first social question. And my other question is that Mary Powell in her remarks talked about love, and I thought that was very interesting. That there's something about motivation to do what is right, or to act creatively, or to express ourselves for the future. And I'm wondering if you see a role for this kind of concept when we're talking about which battery technology is the right technology. So you can do social justice, or you could do love. Who wants to start? Beth, you want to start? Okay.
We're sharing now. Yeah.
Boy, I'm staying away from love. I'll take on the energy benefits widely distributed. I thought Mary's talk about the customer experience and how she's intensely focused on customers, and the fact that they actually have had cost decreases. Customers have seen their bills go down. That's not possible everywhere, but certainly that's a good goal to strive for. So keeping costs as low as possible. So I think that comes back to asking the question, what should we be investing in that is going to benefit everyone broadly? And then, you know, the age-old question of who pays for what? How do those costs get allocated? And maybe that leads us back a little bit to what should industry be funding and what should utilities be funding? And maybe it brings us back to, and what government help should we have to facilitate new technology? So, you know, I'd like to urge more opportunities for industry to be creative, to have part of the process, to come forward with novel, cost-effective solutions that could be analyzed against alternatives that are being looked at. And part of that goes back to how do we make sure we have the updated costs, because things are changing so rapidly. But I think that in my viewpoint, there's only a couple ways that you can make sure that the benefits are widely distributed. You either have to enable customers to, if they're able, to go do their own type of systems, you know, behind the meter, make those investments if it's cost effective for them and they want to do that. Or you have to invest in a system that is going to benefit everyone writ large. And that probably means you have to have some other factors and criteria that you look at. I think Bill Grant or somebody mentioned environmental attributes, and we probably need to do a better job of quantifying offsets. So what are we offsetting in, you know, with storage? Our current statutes and rules only take us so far. It's probably time to relook at those and see what else needs to be added to the scale on either side.
Well, I'm going to start with the last thing you mentioned, which is kind of why do we want storage? Well, the strongest impetus is because we want to put renewables on the system, okay? And in order to do that to any extent beyond, to use the phrase that somebody used earlier, de minimis, we need storage, okay? Now, the only way around that is to vastly overproduce both wind and solar so that, you know, it's too cheap to even bother because we are doing that much, and then we don't need storage. But we don't want to do that either because while the wind is free and the sun is free, it still means investing in the assets. It means you know, materials and so on, and you know, so there's a balance somewhere. And the storage comes in very nicely to even out the gaps that renewables leaves us. Now, I'd like to throw in another one to illustrate why Mary Powell mentioned love. And it has to do with Rutland. Because Rutland is a very interesting town. It used to be where the cutters of marble lived. That was their main profession. You know, they provided the marble for the Washington Monument and for all those federal buildings in DC and so on. And in fact, they used to have people who went to ports like Boston and looked for Italian immigrants and said, you cut a stone, we have a job. And they gave them a job and so on. But now it's not a business anymore. And so the town of Rutland is basically destitute, big drug problem, no jobs. And Green Mountain Power has gone in there and essentially is reviving the town through the electricity business. And that's where the love comes in.
Well, I'll be real brief. I'm seeing our time. I mean, I think energy it's not about the technology, it's about all of us and all of us who use it. And I think that's part of where the love comes in. I think economic development is a huge part of how we have to think about how does it affect everyone. I'll just say two quick things, though. Thinking about where we put storage also really matters. So people that are at the end of a line, people that have brownouts, that have more resilience issues, where their substation is located and all of that, a lot of those are in lower income communities. let's tackle some of those places first. And then we really got to think about sort of that grid defection death spiral scenario and who's going to be left using the grid, and so getting the rules right so that we're bringing people along.
Great comments. Just very briefly, but I'll address the love question also. And Mary's talk actually impressed me very much that she had, maybe it's because it's a smaller group, but she was able to get everybody in the same room, customers and suppliers and so on, and talk about the common good. And that's a little more difficult in New York City or in Chicago or a big city. You just don't, get agreement, and you don't get everybody in the same room almost any time. But maybe that's what we need to focus on, because there is an awful lot of common good. And to your first point, one of those common goods is the environment. So it's kind of income agnostic. The environment, we all share it. To the extent that we can value it, put a price on carbon, let's say, put a price on toxic emissions that are bad for the public health and so on. Those things are often not taken into account in the economic case, and maybe they should be. And that, of course, would extend the benefits to a much wider income range.
Okay. Let's see if there's any questions in the audience. I can't see the audience very well.
Do you want to ask it yourself? Or do you want me to? It's okay. Yeah. Okay. Okay, we have a question I'm going to read for somebody here. We are developing updated something cathodes, material and related lithium-ion batteries. Do you think it's a good direction for energy storage?
I would say actually it is lithium iron phosphate. I mean, we are doing graphene modified lithium iron phosphate material. So, but we are wondering it is good direction for the energy storage, because we can easily to achieve up to 3,000 cycles, and with super safe and with very low cost. So I mean, it's totally different direction compared to Tesla. So this is our question. Thank you.
So tiny comment. I agree with you. I think that's an interesting cathode, and everyone talks up. Okay. Yeah. So lithium. So everyone thinks the lithium-ion battery is a single battery. It isn't. So it pretty much has. There's three parts to a battery: the anode, the electrolyte, the cathode. Never mind what they are. The cathode is the thing that's different about lithium-ion, and the cathode that you were talking about, iron phosphate, does not have a highest energy density as a cobalt oxide, which is the alternative cathode would. It's safer. It has a longer life. And I know that the Chinese company BYD exclusively, or almost exclusively, uses the iron phosphate cathode because it's economically effective. It doesn't wear out after 8 years. It gets a much longer lifetime and calendar lifetime. And I think it's a little bit underlooked outside of BYD. They seem to have embraced it. But I think that it's an example of how you can have many different kinds of batteries serving different functions, and you just don't always want to take the same one. Imre, do you want to?
I just want to perhaps offer a way to reconcile this issue of cost. Much has been made about cost. Gee, it's a big problem. And others during the day have said, well, no, it's not as cost effective. I think the reason for that apparent disparity is that you need to ask, well, whose costs? I think if we had a completely transparent, open set of price signals, a lot more storage would be happening. We're clearly seeing a growing interest in storage by utilities. On the utility side of the meter, there's a whole world of applications on the other side of the meter that in many cases are not, they're not getting the proper price signals, they're not getting the true value for the cost. So I think both things are true. I think it's cost effective and cost is a problem. And it gets back really to policy. And there's a whole world now that the Supreme Court has come down on FERC's side on demand response. And we're starting to see the bright line between retail and wholesale which has been, part of the gospel of the Federal Power Act since 1935, that's starting to get to be blurry. And I think there's going to be some real progress here on the policy side, I hope. So I'd be interested in any perspectives on that topic.
Yeah? Yeah? Yeah, good. Okay, next thumbs up. That's a great comment.
Yes, my question has to do with space as opposed to time. So storage is time shifting, but one of the big benefits is to delay upgrades in transmission and distribution grid. So it strikes me that distributed storage would have some value. And on the other hand, I can imagine, we saw very large installations here, that there's some economy of scale of having large centralized storage facilities. So I was wondering if you could comment on the benefit of distributed storage and trying to sort of solve the mismatch between the supply and demand more locally and in a more distributed way.
Okay. Actually, we have been doing a lot of distributed storage throughout the meeting. When we are talking behind the meter, if it's a residential unit, it's distributed storage, of course, and even if it's a small business. If it's a large commercial installation, then it's beginning to look more like grid-scale storage. But the smaller types of storage, like individual homes, if they are not just supposed to be, well, let me call it vanity installations, need to be aggregated. Otherwise they're not really going to do the grid any good. In fact, they're going to cause problems to the grid, and probably to the individual owner as well.
I'll just quickly add that I think there are different ways that you can get to scale. And so sometimes it's building big, and sometimes it's building many little. And if we can get to, as you were talking about, balance of system costs and sort of getting models that can be replicated, that can be another way of help, I think, mitigating against that. Oh, sorry.
And just to go back over onto the bulk transmission side for a minute, I think we need to do more work on when is it appropriate for storage to substitute for transmission. I mean, if our ultimate goal is to increase the penetration level of renewables, what's the most cost-effective and fastest way to do that? Because I think one of the key barriers for all of this generation shift we're seeing is time. We can't do it fast enough.
Yeah, tiny, can I make one comment? And that was that, it says stop. I get to ignore it, wow. So a comment on the distributed storage. So there are, as Imre was saying, two ways to go. You can go utility, you can go home. Home may be a little too small because myself as the customer and manager in charge of my house, I don't know enough about it, and so I'll probably do it badly. If I had a neighborhood of homes, it could be done by an aggregator who would do it well. So there is some middle ground, maybe, that we really want to touch on.
Well, the last two questions actually got to what I was going to talk about, but there is one other third part to it. So we have the cost of the systems, I agree, are coming down, but the cost that's limiting us here in the Midwest is the demand charge cost. I know it's hard to believe that I'm going to say the demand charges aren't high enough, but at a $14 demand charge, I had a building with 100 kilowatt solar, the demand of the building's 100 kW, and I got a 32-year payback on a Tesla system. So it just can't be done here that way, which then leads me to say, well, then it really should be done because of the pricing signals on the utility side. Well, we had a similar situation when the solar gardens came out. Our main investor-owned utility said, maybe we'll get 10 to 50 megawatts. Within 2 months, they had 1,000 megawatts of applications. They said, that's too many, we can't handle it, it's an engineering nightmare. So the solar community said, why don't you tell us where you're having problems on the grid, and we'll try to site solar gardens there. Unavailable information. So I think for storage to really work, at least in our state, from what I've seen, is the Public Utility Commission has to force the utility to say, before you put in another peaker plant, prove to us that storage won't work.
No, I sure don't.
Well, that might be the last word then. It's certainly a useful one. Yeah, that's the final point. Okay, there she is, Ellen.
I think we're ready to wrap. Thank you very much, and thank you for your closing sentiment there. Thank you, panel, and I just have a couple of last-minute things before we exit the theater. Thank you. That was fantastic, and thank you for your last sentence, because that was my line from my 200-page report. So I appreciate you summing it up. That was fantastic. Nicely done. We appreciate it. Thank you all so much. We appreciate all of you being here. And for those of you who stayed for the whole day, even better, if you look in your packets, in your folder, you will find a free drink ticket. And if you're super lucky, you might even find 2 in there sometimes. So I know I did. And it's not just because I work here. It was watch our website. We will have a video replay of this entire event, and we'll have all the slides posted, and that will just take a little while. We will also send you an evaluation follow-up, so please reply to that, because we really value your feedback and input, and that helps us do the next thing. A couple more things, then Barb wants to say something. That's all I have to say, except thank you again to our sponsors. Barb, did you have something to add?
The drinks are on the 4th floor at the campus club. That's where you get your drinks. There's food. We'll have people out the doors here directing you up to the elevators. If you can't, just right around the other side of Jamba Juice.
In this building, 4th floor, see you there, and we do need to exit the theater. Thank you so much for being here.